Okay, thank you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Amen. Welcome everyone this evening to our 17th annual Lenten Lecture Series at St. George Greek Orthodox Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, this year of 2018. Our Wednesday evening's theme has been virtual pilgrimage. These last several Wednesdays we've been talking about our pilgrimage we made last fall to the sites in the Holy Land. And as many of you know, our trip actually began in St. Petersburg, Russia. And so we're going to be talking about all the things we saw when we were there in St. Petersburg. I'd like to welcome Deb Korlukas with us tonight, along with Bridget and Sarah and Pres Jane and I don't know if anybody else is here that went on a pilgrimage with us, but Deb was really the organizer, especially for the Russia portion of the trip. So thank you, Deb, and welcome. So as we begin, I think it's helpful to orient ourselves on the map to kind of understand where St. Petersburg is. As you can see here is Europe, France, Spain, England, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and then the small countries of the Eastern Bloc here, and then right up here with the star is St. Petersburg. And it's in this body of water here that leads to it, if you will, is called the Gulf of Finland, which makes sense because Finland's right here. Now, just to give you a little different perspective, closer up view here, you can see Russia in the tan, and the other countries in kind of a light beige. And you can see the strategic point that St. Petersburg is located is on this waterway that goes, there's 3 rivers that come together in the city of St. Petersburg, leading in out to the Gulf of Finland. So it's a significant strategic point for trade, commerce, and military concerns. And then this is a little different view. So you can see how big Russia is here. You're kind of looking more from a polar point of view, looking down. And this is just to kind of show you what everybody knows where Moscow is, or everybody's familiar with Moscow. And then St. Petersburg is straight north. And one of the other places I'm going to show you is Novgorod. Now there's 2 Novgorods. There's Nizhny Novgorod here, which is kind of southeast of Moscow, but the one that we went to is Veliki Novgorod, which is between St. Petersburg and Moscow, but closer to St. Petersburg. And this is kind of a map of the city, but it's kind of blurry. But we're going to talk a little bit about the Hermitage, which is the summer palace, if I remember correctly, for the Romanov family. Winter palace, okay, I thought it was one or the other. And we'll be talking about that along with several other sites in the city, but where we stayed, the hotel that we stayed is just a few blocks from there, kind of in this area. And this is one of the rivers, here another river here, and the Neva River is probably the more well-known one here. There's several sites that we were not able to go to. There's so many, but unfortunately, I think we'll be lucky if we even cover everything that we saw in St. Petersburg tonight. So just a little bit about St. Petersburg. It's the 2nd largest city in Russia after Moscow. Its population is 5 million people. As I mentioned, it's an important port in the Baltic Sea. It's situated on the Neva River as well as the other rivers. As you may know, St. Petersburg the name was changed in 1914 to Petrograd. Berg sounded a little too German for some people, so Grad is better. And then, of course, after the revolution in 1924, it was changed to Leningrad, so it was no longer the city of Peter, it now became the city of Lenin. And then, of course, after the fall of communism, it reverted to its original name. And the reason it's called the City of Peter is because it was founded by Peter the Great in the year 1703, Peter being part of the Romanov dynasty, the ruling family, if you will, of the Russian, the country of Russia. St. Petersburg is really in many ways a European-looking city, or an old European-looking city, because that's the way Peter wanted it. He had already been traveled internationally. He had seen the great cities of Europe, and this was going to be his city, and he modeled it after many of his other cities that he saw, or at least incorporated certain elements. Now this is, I like this a little better. This view is kind of gives you a little bit of a texture to it and a little different angle, but so you can see this is the kind of the city center in this area. As I mentioned, the Hermitage, and then St. Isaac's Cathedral, which we'll also be talking about, is here. But it's also helpful because we're going to talk about Peterhof. I'll show you some photos of Peterhof, which is that's the summer palace, right, of Peter the Great. And then also in between there, down in this area, well, not really between, but then this area is Sarkui Selo, which is also known as the Tsar's Village, or Pushkin. And there's some very interesting stuff to see there. So we'll be talking about that as well. The first thing that I think we'll cover is the St. Isaac Cathedral, because it's the landmark church of St. Petersburg. Let me just go to those photos. So this is kind of a view we might have from the street that our hotel was on, but it was kind of more like a zoom shot. So it's a little farther away than this photo would look. You can see the very top of the church is under construction or renovation here, so that's why this kind of odd looking thing at the top is there. But St. Isaac's Cathedral is a colossal domed cathedral built in the 19th century after a design by Auguste Montferrand, who was a French architect. Its magnificent dome, one of the city's most famous symbols, is visible from far away. This is the fourth church or temple at this site dedicated to St. Isaac the Confessor, who was a monk in the 4th century, who was imprisoned by the Roman Emperor Valens. The feast day of the church is May 3rd. St. Isaac's feast day is May 30th, which is the birthday of Peter the Great. And this was one of the reasons for the Russian Tsar to have built the church in honor of St. Isaac. The original wooden church was constructed as early as 1707, just 4 years after Peter the Great founded the city. St. Isaac's Cathedral has a Greek cross ground plan with a large central dome and 4 smaller domes at each corner, 4 monumental porticos supported by enormous Corinthian columns in red granite are decorated with reliefs and sculptures. The magnificent dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral rises to a height of 101 meters, which is how many feet? 300 and something, 333 feet. So to give you an idea of how high that is, does anybody know how tall or high the Cathedral of St. Paul down the street is? Anybody? It's 186 feet to the top of the dome. So that gives you an idea that this is almost twice as tall as our Grand Cathedral here in St. Paul. So just look at, and again, this is going to be kind of a whirlwind tour because of time, and so sorry for that. These are one of the main entry doors into the church, very large bronze doors with sculpted or molded figures in them. This actually is a different set of doors. If I remember correctly, I think you enter from the south side of the church is the main entrance, but these are the doors of the west entrance of the church, but this is from the inside. And this, if you basically turn around and face to the east, now you're looking at the iconostas and altar. So you can get a sense of the scale. You see the people standing in front, and you see the icons, which are even farther away, are how much taller. And then you have basically 3 levels to that iconostas, which is somewhat common in Russia, in the Russian tradition, to have very large, elaborate iconostases for the church. And then you can see up above there, a lot of the icons are in the west, you see here, are in a Western Renaissance style, which makes sense because they were done, this church was built in the 1800s, this structure itself. But we will see some more, if you will, Byzantine style icons in other places that we visited. This is a little closer, looking to the north side. And I don't think I have any photos, but this entrance or opening right here is also goes into another chapel, a side chapel, which is probably almost as big as our church. And there was a service going on, and they were anointing people with holy oil, and so we availed ourselves of that. This is now looking up above the altar area into the dome. You see the big barrel structure there before you actually get to the dome right above. And that's looking straight up. You can't, I guess, you can't overemphasize the ornate decoration of this church in particular, but it's very common in Russian iconography and church decoration. They're rather ornate decorations that surround the icons, and it's visually stunning. So I thought that was an interesting depiction. I'm sure you can tell who those people are. Adam and Eve, and with the animal creation. Now, this is a mosaic that is being either refurbished or constructed. It's on an easel, it's at ground level, it's going to be placed up above. And I can't remember the story, Deb, you might remember, I think they were doing these mosaics to look exactly like the murals that they were going to cover or replace.
Well, most all the churches, when renovation is necessary, they'll renovate it back to its original state and back to its original style of iconography. Peter the Great brought in the Italian influence, so that's why you see this is that Nasirian, Byzantine, pure Byzantine tradition. But various churches will have a different influence of the Western style, and therefore many icons were either destroyed or not recovered or buried or whatnot. So they would continue to reconstruct what the original was.
Yeah, so we have to remember that because of communism, which dominated for 80 years in Russia, many of the churches were destroyed, many of them were vandalized, many of them were turned into all sorts of other purposes. So since the fall of communism, there's been a huge effort at restoration for almost all the churches, including rebuilding ones that were destroyed.
For instance, like some of the interior marble or brass that was taken away from the churches, they were put in the metro stations, they were put in the public places so that they could glorify the state rather than glorifying the church. glorifying God in the church.
And another interesting thing is that many of the churches are still owned by the state, and they are, some of the church communities have to pay the state rent or lease to use the church. The churches are kind of still, in some ways, considered cultural properties.
Yeah. Or if you have rich oligarchs or merchants, the smaller churches can be purchased by that particular person and dedicated to that community. But usually that's outside of the cities. Yeah.
This looks like the pulpit or lectern. And this is the famous icon. I do remember which one it is that's in St. Isaac's Cathedral. Is it Smolensk.
Yeah.
And I don't have, I don't have the story about that icon, but I do have a little bit about the other icon that we'll see. This is looking into the altar. Just notice how large the doors of the Holy Gate are. And this is more renovations. There looks like there's a paper. Is this a mosaic where they've had applied like a cheesecloth with the glass pieces to it, and they're peeling that away now? Yeah.
It looks like the size of it.
And if you know a little bit about mosaics, they do the pieces in sections of varying sizes, but it's obviously a lot easier to handle it that way. So they do a section, they plaster it, they put it on, and they do another one. Of course, they're all numbered, so they appear in the correct order, and it looks appropriate. So this, I didn't take this photo. I grabbed it, like many others, if you've seen it, grabbed it off the internet. But it's a nice kind of panoramic view of the whole church, in a sense. So you're looking from north on your left to south on your right, and then east straight ahead towards the altar. And that's me.
Is that an icon?
Yeah, right. So we'll go on to the next thing, which is the Church of the Spilled Blood. And I'll just tell you a little bit about it before we look at all the photos. This was one of my favorite churches that we saw. It's beautiful on the, I mean, it says as beautiful on the outside as it is on the inside, in different ways. But the magnificent Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood is one of St. Petersburg's most memorable landmarks. The church, built at the end of the 19th century, is constructed in classical Russian style, decorated with colorful domes and glazed tiles. Officially consecrated as the Church of the Resurrection of Christ, the Russian Orthodox gem, more commonly known as the Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood, was built to honor Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who was assassinated at the site where the church now sits, hence the reference to spilled blood. The section of the street on which the assassination took place is enclosed within the walls of the church, and the site of the murder is marked by a chapel in the building. So this would be looking at the main entrance, which is on the north side of the church, kind of in the corner, and that where Tsar Alexander II was assassinated is almost directly in front of you as you enter the church. So it'll be on kind of what we consider the western end of the church. This is the courtyard outside the church, and it's not uncommon there to see merchants on the street, especially close to churches or places where tourists would be selling their wares of various sorts. There's another view. And this, if I remember correctly, is still considered a state church, and thus you have to pay a fee to go in.
It's under debate right now, whether the Patriarchate wants it back, but then they don't have enough money to keep it up, so the government doesn't. It's beneficial for the churches to still be in the government, especially the ones that the tourists visit, in order for them to be renovated and the maintenance.
So notice the ornate domes, onion domes, Russian style. There's Deb. You're one of the pillars, that's why you're pictured there.
Not a month ago though. Right on the ground.
Now this is inside the church, and I have to say this church is incredibly, you just kind of takes your breath away when you walk in, because the whole interior, and it's a rather large church, not nearly as large as St. Isaac's Cathedral, but the whole interior is covered with mosaic iconography. And it's a tall church, so you really you just keep looking up and up, and you just everywhere you look, there's a story or a saint or something to be engaged by it. And the acoustics in there are incredible as well. They were having divine liturgy when we came in, and there was a beautiful choir singing, but you couldn't see them. They were behind the altar on the right, and their voices just carried throughout the building.
We were lucky to get those pictures because some of us got reprimanded.
Yes, I was trying to be stealthy, and because we were not supposed to be taking photos, and I confess. That's outside again, a little different view of the entrance there. And there's a canal that runs right along the right side here. So that is.
St. Petersburg is called the Venice of the North.
Oh, there you go.
No.
Venice of the North. So the Church of the Resurrection, I don't know if you can see the icon, kind of a westernized style of icon of the resurrection, the angel at the tomb, the stone being rolled away, Jesus leaving the tomb.
This style on the church is Art Nouveau. They categorize it as Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau, like new art.
Art Nouveau, new art.
It's a period of art.
I'm impressed by the carved stone and the brickwork. It's like I said, it's very Russian. It's just the ornateness. I was trying to take these photos to capture that detail. There's close to Barb in front of the church there, so it gives you a little idea of the scale. I must have some duplicates in there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the Lady of Kazan Church. Our Lady of Kazan, also called the Mother of God of Kazan, was a holy icon of the highest stature within the Russian Orthodox Church, representing the Virgin Mary as the protector and patroness of the city of Kazan, and a palladium of all of Russia, known as the Holy Protectress of Russia. According to legend, the icon was originally acquired from Constantinople, lost in 1438, and miraculously recovered in pristine state over 140 years later in 1579. Two major cathedrals, the Kazan Cathedral in Moscow and the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, are consecrated to Our Lady of Kazan, and they display copies of the icon, as do numerous churches throughout the land. The original icon in Kazan was stolen and likely destroyed around 1904. Everybody's heard of Our Lady of Fatima, right? That's based on the Kazan Mother of God icon. The Kazan Cathedral of the Russian Orthodox Church was constructed, or began construction in 1801 and continued for 10 years under the supervision of its architect, and it was completed in 1811. I'll just read real quick here. After Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, the commander-in-chief, General Mikhail Kutuzov, asked Our Lady of Kazan for help. Then, at this point, is when the purpose of the church was altered. The Patriotic War was over. Russians saw the cathedral primarily as a memorial to their victory over Napoleon. Kutuzov himself was interred in the cathedral in 1813, and Alexander Pushkin, who was a famous poet, wrote celebrated lines meditating over his sepulchre. In 1815, keys to 17 cities and 8 fortresses were brought by the victorious Russian army from Europe and placed in the cathedral's sacristy. In 1837, Boris Orlovsky designed 2 bronze statues of Kutuzov and of Barclay de Tolly, which stand in front of the cathedral. The cathedral's interior, with its numerous columns, echoes the exterior colonnade and is reminiscent of a palatial hall, being 69 meters in length and 62 meters in height. So that's approximately 210 feet long and 180 feet in height. So about the same as the Cathedral of St. Paul. The interior features numerous sculptures and icons created by the best Russian artists of the day. A wrought iron grille separating the cathedral from a small square behind it is sometimes cited as one of the finest ever constructed. The cathedral's huge bronze doors are one of 4 copies of the original doors of the baptistry in Florence, Italy. So let's take a look at the photos. I don't have a whole lot. So this is kind of looking from the courtyard. If you're in the courtyard, these colonnades come out to basically kind of envelop you, and there's multiple columns, and they're covered in what do you call it? Pedestals above. I think there's another photo. You'll get the idea. And of course, this is seen. I think this is kind of the symbol of the eye of God, correct? Or is it a different symbol? Kind of the all-seeing eye, which
I think so.
A little more Western kind of influence. So there's the colonnades. And so it kind of reminds you of St. Peter's in Rome. This is inside. There was tons of people there when we were there, and then we went there in the evening, a weekday evening. There was no service. I don't think there was a service going on. It's just that's how many tourists and how many faithful people come to venerate the icon of the Lady of Kazan. And that's this right here is the icon. And so there's a line of people waiting to venerate the icon. And this is the iconostasi. So this will be the east end of the church. There's kind of a zoom shot. It's not real clear, but gives you an idea. And then this is obviously the floor kind of in the middle of the church, where would be covered by the central dome. But I thought this tile work was impressive because it gives you an impression of depth. You know, not easy to achieve. So this would be looking to the right of the front of the church, so to the south side. And then this is taken from the very back of the church, looking to the east, which is the altar. And it wasn't, again, it was night and there was no service, so there was no lights on, so it was a little bit dark. But these, you can see how big these columns are, granite or marble columns inside the church. And there's numerous columns. And then this, I believe, is where the Tsar would sit during services, and I believe that's an icon of Tsar Nicholas and his son, Alexei, right? And then this is, so when we went in, it was light out. When we came out, it was more dark, and then they lit up the colonnade. That's quite impressive. Okay, yeah. So the next thing we could, I think I'm going to skip the St. Alexander Nevsky Lavra because I don't have very many photos. But we'll talk about the St. John of Rila Monastery, which is it was a convent named after St. John of Rila, but it was started by St. John of Kronstadt, the famous Russian Orthodox priest, and it founded in about the year 1900. The convent was disbanded by the Soviets in 1923, and it wasn't reopened until 1991 after the fall of communism. The convent, as I said, is dedicated to the Venerable John of Rila as a metolkion, or dependency of the female community in the honor of St. John the Theologian in the village of Sura in his native land. St. John of Rila himself lived in the late 9th, early 10th century. He was a Bulgarian hermit and was revered as a saint while he was still alive. The legend surrounding him tells of wild animals that freely came up to him and birds that landed in his hands. His followers founded many churches in his honor, including the famous Rila Monastery. Okay, so go to the photos. Now, I didn't take this one, and we didn't visit there in the daytime. We actually went there in the evening, so I grabbed this one off the internet.
That's why it looks so good, huh?
Yeah, it's quite beautiful, impressive. So most of the photos here are the sepulcher of St. John of Kronstadt, so it's in the lower level of the monastery. And this would be an icon of St. John of Kronstadt. And since he was a modern saint of our time, there's many photos of him, including this one. So this is his sepulcher. And we blessed our crosses over his tomb. And then the nun, I forget her name, brought out oil that was blessed there in the monastery, and we anointed, everybody was anointed with the oil. And that's our group. And that's looking down there, so you can see it's a beautiful kind of gold inlaid icon of him on top of his tomb. Interesting, when John of Kronstadt died, there was an article about him in the New York, I think it was the New York Times. This is 1908, so that's how famous he was already by the time of his death. The news of his passing went all the way to America. And then this is upstairs. There's a large chapel church in the upstairs. And there was a service going on at the time we were there. And then this is a reliquary, and I forgot. I had the information, but I don't have it with me, of all the saints that are here. There's little relics of several saints. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is talk about the Hermitage. So this is the outside. State Hermitage Museum is one of the largest and oldest museums in the world and an absolute must-see for any visitor to St. Petersburg. The museum was founded in 1764 by Catherine the Great, who was Empress of Russia at the time, and later opened to the public in 1852. Not only does the Hermitage boast one of the world's greatest art collections, the museum is also worth a visit for its sumptuous interior. The Winter Palace, in particular, is magnificent with its marvelous Georgian staircase and dazzling splendor of the many state rooms. Now, again, we don't have time to talk about all of the various collections that are there, but it certainly rivals or maybe even exceeds the Louvre in Paris. I mean, it's that, I mean, it's, we rushed through there in about 2 or 3 hours. I think you could have spent 2 or 3 weeks there exploring all the treasures. So I'm just going to show you some photos. So this is the Hermitage in green. If you look the other direction across the big square, open square, is one of the large government buildings. But that just gives you, this is very typical of St. Petersburg, is these large buildings, whether they're of civic use or churches or apartment buildings. They're very large and they're kind of on that grand scale. So, I mean, looking at this, you can see how big this building is, but it's only 3 floors. So the ceilings are about 15 feet high or more for each level. There's our group again. This is the grand staircase, I believe, when you first kind of enter into the halls. See the ceiling painting. Almost looks like something Michelangelo would have done. Notice all the gold gilding. They're super ornate. This, I believe, is one of the halls where the Tsar would receive guests. You know, we think that here in America, you know, we think that the about wealthy families, but I think the Romanovs exceeded all. I mean, the wealth that the Romanovs had was just, it's almost beyond comprehension. So this is the chapel of the Hermitage. These are all generals, I believe, of the army. This is a different hall, some sort of reception hall. Notice this is, I don't know if I have a close-up of it elsewhere, but did you notice up here, St. George? This is the famous Peacock Clock. I can't remember when it was built, but it's an amazing invention that tells not just time, but keeps track of the calendar year. And it's run, so it doesn't run by electricity, it runs on mechanical springs. And then when I think it's, if it's the top of the hour, whenever it alarms, the wings of the peacock spread out. And we're all marveling at it there. There's a story there, but we don't have time to cover it. So these, I believe this is a Rembrandt. There's a whole collection of Rembrandts, and we spent a lot of time covering Rembrandts, which is great if you love Rembrandt, but we missed out on the ancient Egyptian collection from the 10th century BC. So a lot of these are Rembrandts. That would be, of course, the crucifixion, lowering Jesus from the cross. This is the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. This is a large vase star. I don't know what type of stone or this is. Malachite. And this is Nadia. Nadia was our guide through most of our time in Russia. She's a teacher at the seminary there, a very gracious host and very super knowledgeable guide. So you can take a walking tour with the headphones. We didn't do that, but there's signage for most of the art there. It tells you who the artist is, the title, the dates. This is one of the halls. Can you get an idea of how big this place is, or how far that hall goes? It's like it's like a football field down there. And it's every inch is decorated. Some famous, well-known sculpted pieces. This is one of the most impressive ones. I mean, when you think about how you can capture the dynamism of this figure with this animal in stone, to give it this sense of it's like a photograph capturing a moment in time, it's amazing. Outside, inside again, there's close to the grand staircase, repeat, chapel again. Look at that little pulpit there. Climb up in there. Another view of the Peacock Clock. So I must not have had a chance to sort these photos, so these are some repetition here. They were running through their click. Okay, that's it for that. So I'm going to skip the Russian Museum, and because I do want to cover Novgorod and Peterhof. So Peterhof was built in the early 18th century, so that's 1700s, by Tsar Peter the Great as a magnificent palace and park complex meant to rival France's Versailles, and it does rival it. On an estate that covers more than 600 hectares, Peter and his successors built some 30 palaces and pavilions in a mesmerizing display of wealth and power. So I'll just go right to the photos. These I did try to organize in a way that we saw them as we entered into the complex. So I can't really do it justice, but when you see the gold gilding on the outside of these buildings, it's like a beacon that just kind of draws you to it. And so on one end is this structure, and I can't remember what this part of the building is for, if anybody remembers, but that's on one, this is on one end, the other end is the actual chapel that you see here. We weren't able to go inside the chapel. So as you're at this level, you're looking, and if you kind of turn to your left and you're looking out towards the gardens, this is kind of what you see. And then as you move to the middle, you see this kind of canal that goes out to the main, the Gulf of Finland there. So you could, in other words, you could access the palace by boat, and you could actually, at one time, you could bring your boat right inside the palace. This, I think, is a, yes. So I don't know, hopefully you'll be able to hear this. So can you hear the ducks quacking and the dogs barking? And that's kind of an electromechanic. I don't know if it's some sort of, maybe it's driven by water. I don't know how it was originally designed, but kind of impressive for its time. So this is looking, so now we're down by the canal area and looking back up towards the palace. And that's the chapel. Notice I think it's some sort of mosaic pictures or images here. And these are, I believe, these are kind of cascading pools that go down.
Are those religious?
Well, to be honest, I didn't notice, or you can't really get, I couldn't really get close enough to get a good vantage to see what they're actually about. But there may be some religious imagery in there, but I'm guessing it's probably not real prominent.
It's myth gives. It's about myth.
Myths?
Yeah, myths.
Myths.
Oh, myths. Yes.
Like
Mythology.
Samson who is steering lines miles apart.
Yeah, that's
So,
the
like,
middle one. The big one.
Ancient mythology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Recognize those people? And they
Oh,
said, no photos. or unless you pay. There was, I don't know what there were costumed people, and I think you could take a photo with them, and you obviously would pay for that. Okay, so I'm just going to show you real quick the Tsar's village. So the Tsar's village was a town containing a former Russian residence of the Imperial family and visiting nobility, located about 15 miles south from the center of St. Petersburg. It is now part of the town of Pushkin. And it's, and like almost everything else you've seen here, is considered a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. In the 17th century, the estate belonged to a Swedish noble. Its original Finnish name is usually translated as a higher ground. In 1708, Peter the Great gave the estate to his wife, the future Empress Catherine I, as a present. She founded the Annunciation Church there in 1724 and changed the name of the settlement. The town escaped 19th century industrialization. In 1918, the fall of the Tsars, the town was renamed by the Bolsheviks to Detskoye Selo, or Children's Village, instead of Tsar's Village. And in 1937, it was renamed again to the town of Pushkin, thus commemorating the centenary of the poet's death. In 1941, the Germans occupied the town, destroying and plundering many historical monuments, buildings, and other cultural artifacts, including the famous Amber Room. The Red Army liberated the town in 1944. After the war, reconstruction began, and many rooms of Catherine's palace have been restored. But much of the work on the palatial church and the Alexander Palace is still underway. We were not able to go into these buildings because there were some dignitaries or politicians who came at the last minute, and so they canceled whatever opening for the regular tourists. This is the church of, it's one of my favorite churches. It's the Nevsky Imperial Cathedral. I don't know why I liked it so much. It's just, but it's kind of off by itself. It was just, it's not too uncommon in Russia. It's like it just kind of these churches. There's churches all over, but they just kind of are just there, and I don't know how to describe it. When you go in, this church was built in 1901. It was, let's see, in 1881, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, Alexander III, his successor, issued a command to organize a special emperor's composite infantry regiment, blah, blah, blah. That's not what I'm looking for. Anyways, I think this was...
This is Novgorod.
Yeah,
This is not St. Petersburg. It's Novgorod already. It's 10th, 11th, 12th century.
Right, but it's near Pushkin, this church.
Oh, maybe I know.
This church, I'm pretty sure.
Oh,
Remember we stopped?
where the Tsar's family prayed a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that the
They
one
were,
where
that's this one.
Alexander prayed for a boy?
Yeah, this was, I think it was dedicated either as a wedding gift for Nicholas and Alexandra, or for the birth of their son.
Right,
And they had a special room even below that when the Tsar went to the Tsar's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all new iconography. We actually observed the iconographer's painting in the church.
Yeah, right.
There was one you can see this one.
So there's another view of the outside. And then,
Because we didn't get into where we were intending to go, then we got veered off into that church. We didn't even know what we would find there.
which actually might have turned out for the best.
Yeah.
So you see Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, and the church they're holding there is the church we're in. You see this beautiful iconostasi, multi-level, and then notice these huge pillars that are kind of framing it, that are holding up the central dome of the church, and how ornately decorated they are. And then, as Deb mentioned, there were iconographers working while we were there, so there was scaffolding, and you could kind of see what they were doing. And he's doing this decorative design work on the stairwell. This is an interpretation, I believe, of the hospitality of Abraham, of the three angels visiting. There you get an idea of the size of the pillars.
I just remember, this church wasn't in use for a long time, but I remember this church they used when foreign princes would come to Russian prince to get married, they would baptize in Russian, Christianity, in this particular church, and they always gave them like second name after this Theodore. So they became like patronymic name from the same saint in this church before they got married to Russian princes.
So foreign princesses, if they would become Orthodox before they would get married to the Russian royalty. This was a photo I grabbed off the internet just because it was a sunny photo, sunshine. So that's that. Now it's 5:07 after, and I want to respect everybody's times. I can continue because we, I maybe need another 5 or 10 minutes. So if you need to leave, you're welcome to leave. But I'm just going to keep going here. We're almost done. Okay, so let's look at Novgorod. It's the last place we'll look here today. So this was Michael, our driver, who was with us the whole time. Nadia, our tour guide through the whole trip. And then I don't remember the name of this lady, but she was
Svetlana.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Svetlana. So she was our guide when we were in Novgorod for the day. And the guides were very good, extremely knowledgeable, well-educated. They knew their stuff. So this, when you come outside of Novgorod, this is the Kremlin. Kremlin, you've heard that word Kremlin, and you may not know that it means fortress. That's what the word Kremlin means. So they call this the Kremlin of Novgorod, which is a fortress. And you can see it's kind of an early medieval era. And this bridge goes over an empty canal. And at one time, they diverted the river through this canal. So it was like a big moat that would be part of the protection. Barbara, they get a lot of shots in here. So you can get a size, an idea of the scale of the entrance there, but you can almost see that this might have been rebuilt. You notice the brickwork looks a little newer there, so I'm not sure if that's an original gate or entryway. when you walk through, there's this church, I think it was St. Sophia, correct? That one of the first things you see when you go through the gate. And I have photos of the inside of that. This is probably an 11th century church, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, North Carolina is the 11th century settlement, so, yeah, what we see is 11th.
Yeah. Now this statue is very famous, commemorates the, if I remember correctly, it commemorates the 1,000-year anniversary of the founding of Russia as a nation state, which was the year 862. So 1862, this statue was built or dedicated. And there's the whole story about all the figures in there, but I don't remember.
Prince Uruk was from Scandinavia and set up a government.
Prince Uruk.
Well, because it was from Scandinavia, so how could they not that, you know? And the Nazis invaded that place in 1944, and that's as far as they got. It was at North or what do you call it? No.
On their way to Moscow, or?
Yes, yeah, something, yeah. There, that's what I know.
So as Deb mentioned, this is a 10th century, 11th century settlement. So everything, a lot of this stuff is almost 1,000 years old. This is inside the church now. We weren't supposed to be taking photos, I confess again. So you can see kind of the little bit newer iconography here. This is probably restored, but then you can see the old stuff on here. And this, of course, being that it's 11th century, it predates the Western influences of art and iconography in Russia, so that it's actually more Byzantine looking.
Although in many of these churches, the original iconography had faded away or changed. So this is probably very much like the 14th or 15th century iconography in the 11th century.
Okay, so a little bit later, but still predating the Western influence.
But yet, the frescoes that you saw that they were renovating, those were original. That kind of stuff is not original. That's post-11th century. Yeah. That's original. So they're able to kind of break that up and get down to the original part.
This is a side chapel. So you can see the plastering on the outside, but then they've exposed some of it to show the original stonework. And then there's a large, look at how large these bells are compared to the people next to them. And then kind of when you walk through that area, now you come to the river, which river is it? Volkhov River, I believe. And then on the other side from the church is a very, I think, well, I don't know, certainly the best icon museum I've ever seen. It's just amazing the breadth of icons they have, going from as early as, I believe, the 9th century all the way to modern time, but just numerous. You could spend a couple days there exploring. And some of the famous, like this icon of St. Nicholas, and some of these are when you think of a particular icon of a saint, that the originals are in this museum. the famous images that are in our mind. Holy Trinity, or the Hospitality of Abraham. St. Peter and Paul, this is one of the oldest icons in the collection. That was the gilding that went over that icon. They've separated the gilding from the actual icon. There's St. Nicholas. So that's a very famous icon. There's the gilding and the icon right next to each other.
Those the originals?
These are originals. I mean, there probably existed, like many icons, copies are made, years, decades, centuries after, so they look the same. These are fairly old, if I remember correctly. I don't remember exactly which century, but they are certainly, they are originals in the sense that they were painted themselves, but they may be a copy of something that was from an earlier time. There's a protection of Mother of God. Annunciation, Pentecost, live scenes from the life of Christ, Holy Apostles. Okay, are these the Russian saints? Boris and Gleb, the Passion Bearers. Right?
First martyr saints of Russia, but they are out of Kiev.
So a lot of these icons come out of churches that, like this is an iconostasy, and I'm not sure if those churches still exist, but they were probably removed at some point to protect them or keep them as treasures in a safe place. And there's the where people were, they were copying the icons that they were looking at. St. George, Annunciation. And the nice thing also about this museum, because it spans so many centuries, is you can see the progression of how the styles change over time. Might be some repetition in here. This is interesting. That's a holy gate from a church. Look at how ornate that is. There's a weave or carving. So this is like a full iconostas that's been removed from the church. These are a little closer together than they would appear in the church because they're panels that would be set in big frames. Here they're just placed right next to each other. Another one of St. George. Crucifixion. We're outside the Kremlin. And there's ladies getting a royal bride. Barbara Coast again. The locks. What's the story with the locks again? Love locks. People who are in love, they bring a lock and they lock it on a bridge. So it's looking back from the bridge towards the Kremlin walls. I think there's a wedding going on, right? Bride here? Something? There's some ancient churches as well. We didn't get to go in them, but it's on the outside. And then the last place was the Monastery of St. Anne. Sorry, what was it again? The monastery? St. George in Novgorod. Huge monastery complex, and there's only, what, 10 monks that live there? So it shows you kind of what used to be, in terms, because I'm sure there was hundreds, if not thousands there before. And then we went in this church, which was, it was barely, I don't even know if they haven't really done much restoration inside there. This is the inside of the church. And then the last thing was we went to this open air museum, kind of like a where they had gathered these buildings from around the countryside into one area to kind of show what a early medieval Russian village would look like. And these wooden structures. So there's this one's a church, and then this one would be an actual residence. And they would have, the family would live on this upper level front, and in the back, that's the church again. I guess I don't have the back of that, but anyways, it would actually be the stable for their animals would be the back of their residence. So in other words, the barn and the home were one building, and which would make sense for cold Russian winters to not have to travel too far to your barn. So apologize for going over, but I just wanted to share some of these photos with you and share a little bit of the story about what we saw, and thank you for your attention and being here. Hope this was inspiring to some degree or not. We'll close with a prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, faint-heartedness, lust of power, idle talk, but rather give to me your servant the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love. Yes, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own faults and not to judge my brother or sister, for you are holy, always, now, and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen. If you have any questions, feel free to ask our experts over here at the table.
Thank you, Father.